Well, good evening, and sorry to be interrupting our mutual enjoyment of the Carnival of the Animals, but I'm here to welcome you to Caltech's public programming event we're calling Behind the Books, as we feature David J. Anderson, who is the director of the Tien Chow and Chrissy Chen Institute for Neuroscience at Caltech. And he is the campus's Seymour Benser Professor of Biology. He has written a fascinating book. It's called The Nature of the Beast, and he has been getting an awful lot of attention. I understand he was just interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. He was featured in an NPR podcast and stories about his writings and has had an awful lot of coverage nationwide. And we're very happy that you're here with us tonight. And he will be talking with his longtime friend and collaborator, Ralph Adolphs, who is the Bren Professor of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Biology in Caltech's Humanities and Social Sciences Division. We're thrilled to see so many of you, and I just want to let you know that you're part of an international audience. We won't get the specifics of exactly who's joining us this evening, but from our past Behind the Books reports, we've had people in Canada, we've had people in Japan, we've had people from other parts of the world join us. And so we're very happy that we were able to find a way to make a silk purse out of the sad sowsier of the pandemic by taking these on as an online program. And we hope that you will continue to be joining us as we keep producing events online, and then, of course, start doing them in person as we did just last Friday with San Francisco's famous men's chorus, Chanticleer. I'm Michael Alexander, and I'm the Director of Public Programming. And I'm just thrilled that just about 4 years ago, I was recruited to come and join the campus that has played such an important role in my own professional career in the performing arts. A dance company I managed in the early 70s was actually performing on the Beckman Hall stage, the Beckman Auditorium stage. So we are thrilled to have you. And I do want to give a special nod and thanks to the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium. They are the sponsors that are regularly and for years have been supporting all of the programming, particularly those of you who are friends. I want to thank you because you're making it possible for us to do science programs for youth. And we encourage you to look to our website. It's events.caltech.edu, and you can get information about our upcoming Science Journeys events. You can get information about our live events and the two online series that we're doing right now, Behind the Books and Movies That Matter. Our first upcoming live performance is going to be on June 24th at 8 o'clock in the evening, and it's going to take place on the Beckman Mall, just outside of Beckman Auditorium. It's a return visit by Naturally Seven. Quincy Jones says they are the best male choral group, vocal group in the world. And you will be absolutely flabbergasted when you see that there are these seven fellows on stage, and out of their vocal cords come the sounds of a great jazz band or a great rock band, but it's all being produced by their vocal cords. And once you get past the gimmick of the imitating all of those instruments, you're just going to be also astonished by the interesting musicality, their arrangements, the way that they perform and all. We had a standout audience for us the first time we presented them 2 years ago, with people coming to me at intermission saying we've got to bring them back. And we are. And you can get more information about that performance again at events.caltech.edu. So it is with great pleasure now that I'm going to turn the program over to Ralph Adolphs and let him start the conversation with David Anderson. We're going to encourage you to look at the Q&A feature so that you can pose questions. We will have a question and answer session following their conversation. So please stick around for that. Please ask your questions. They'll be transferred over to the speakers, and they will tackle as many as they can in the time remaining. So now it is with great pleasure that I introduce Ralph Adolphs.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thanks to all of you who are joining us this afternoon, all 153 so far. So I'm Ralph Adolphs, and I'm looking forward very much to having a conversation with my friend and colleague, David Anderson, in just a minute. David, as Michael mentioned, is the director of the Chen Neuroscience Institute, and our offices, the office from which I'm zooming to you, are located in the Chen Neuroscience Research Building. In fact, David is just one wall over. His office is next door to mine. And we could sit next to one another and Zoom to you that way, but it's easier to see us on Zoom if we do it from our respective offices. So we'll be talking about the book here, of which I seem to have about 4 copies in my office because I kept forgetting that I had pre-ordered it. I read it, I mentioned to David just before this, that I read it in a single sitting because I found it so engaging. It has a combination of anecdotes, stories about animals, pets, as well as research work that David has done and science. But throughout, it's extremely personal. It's almost like just having a conversation with David and having him tell you what his work is about. So David, if you could join us, and there you are. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me, Ralph?
I can hear you very well. I can almost hear you through the wall next door from next door.
Hope you don't have feedback.
It's great to chat with you. We must do it again over sushi in person, but this is a good substitute.
You're on.
Let me start with a question, with a sort of broad question. So you and I, 4 years ago, had written this book, The Neuroscience of Emotion. And if you go onto Amazon, it's probably fair to say, a glut of books on emotion, most of them from popular psychology. What was it that motivated, inspired you to write this book, The Nature of the Beast?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ralph. I often ask myself that same question while I was struggling with writing the book, because as my first solo author book, it wasn't easy. I had wanted to write a book that the lay public could understand about the field of research in which we worked for a long time. And after writing the book with you, I thought that there were, which I should tell the audience is a readable book, but it was aimed at a more scholarly scientific audience, graduate students and others. I felt that there was good information and points of view in there that the general public should hear about. And I also wanted to counter a growing, wave of commentary and books that suggested that we can only study emotions in humans and that we can't study emotions in animals. And as somebody who studied animals, mainly fruit flies and mice my whole career, I really felt that view needed to be defended.
Great. Well, let me segue into the next question then that I have about that. Right at the beginning of the book, you have a wonderful story about your cats. Both David and I have cats as pets, and many of you have cats or dogs. And I think it's fair to say that almost everybody, when they interact with those animals, cats and dogs, thinks that they have emotions and thinks that they have emotions in much the same way that we humans do. They feel emotions, they have feelings, they have conscious experiences of certain kinds. On the other hand, you also tell us in the book that not only cats and dogs and mice, but flies have emotions. And when we would watch a fly or a worm, we could all agree that they have various kinds of complex behavior, but many people there would balk at saying that they have emotions and would instead say, well, these aren't really emotions, these are mechanistic reflexes of some sort. And that dichotomy or dilemma has sort of been characterized the whole history of emotion in many of the debates, that emotional behavior might be caused by emotions in the same way it's caused in humans, and that's accompanied by conscious feelings, experiences of the emotion. But it might also be caused by something much simpler, where we might not want to say that that's an emotion, like a reflex. Now, in your book, you propose a third sort of middle ground, which is that these behaviors, at least in the first instance, when we want to study them as scientists, are caused by what you call emotion states. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? What is an emotion state? What criteria does one use? And why do you think these are so useful scientifically to apply to animals?
Thanks, Ralph. That's a really good and important question. We conceive of emotion states as a particular state that the brain is in, that it can be put into by an experience, by a memory of an experience, or a particular stimulus that changes the pattern of activity, both electrical activity and chemical activity in a brain that is different from how it was before that stimulus was received, but that lasts for a while and can increase or decrease in its intensity and can carry over into other situations and contexts that are different from the context where it was first aroused. And there are other properties as well. It has a valence, it's positive and negative. So the state changes. What it does is it fundamentally changes how the brain reacts to a particular stimulus. And so one example of this is, if you had a bad day at work and your boss yelled at you and you came home and your baby was screaming at you, you might feel angered by that and you might shout at it. Whereas if you'd had a wonderful day at work and you were feeling positive and optimistic about everything, you might come home to the same crying baby and instead coddle it and rock it back to sleep. So what's different about those situations is a state of the brain. And animals can have those states of the brain as well. For example, a female mouse, when she's a virgin, if approached by a male, will show sexual receptivity so they can mate. The same female mouse, when she's had babies and is nursing her pups, if she's approached by the same male, will viciously attack it to protect her babies. So once again, something internal to the animal has changed that affects the way it responds to particular stimulus. And the important thing is we don't have to argue that the animal is consciously aware of that internal state in order for the state to exist and be something that we can study. The animal may be consciously aware, it may have a feeling of that state, but there's really no scientific way to assess that in any animal other than people. And so this concept of brain states, another example of a brain state is sleep. When you're asleep, you process sounds and other stimuli very differently than when you're awake. This is the middle ground in between feelings, emotional feelings, and sort of robotic-like reflex behaviors that people are sometimes tempted to ascribe to what we would call lower organisms, but they're not really lower, they're just different from us.
Just to follow up on that, so I could imagine somebody thinking, well, this sounds very useful scientifically to have emotion states and to not worry about conscious experiences in the first instance. And so you could have these, what psychologists would call latent variables, emotion states, but they are in the mind of the scientist. That is, it's useful for scientists. And so do you think it's fair to say that a critical role and need for neuroscience specifically is to actually find mechanistic evidence for these states, as opposed to just have them, if you did a factor analysis or something like that, you can have latent variables and constructs that are useful scientifically, but then if you actually look at the mechanism, at the physical mechanism, you might not find that that's exactly how it works. So would you think it's fair to say that neuroscience research is in particular essential to get actual evidence for the state, as opposed to just to propose it sort of theoretically?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And we view neuroscience as sort of a bridge between psychology, which is a way of describing feeling states of mind, and ethology, which is the description of animal behavior as viewed from the outside in a very observational manner. The point of neuroscience is to try to take apart the brain and understand the nuts and the bolts of brain processing, electrical and chemical, that contribute to these states or these state properties. Where in the brain is this happening? What kind of neurons are controlling these states? How are these properties of persistence and scalability, waxing and waning of the intensity of emotion states? How and where are they controlled? And so if we can put biological flesh on these conceptual bones, it allows us to think about emotion as not a unique property of humans, but a biologically evolved function that is in continuity with us and other animals in this planet. And it also puts us in a much better position to try to understand what might go wrong in people when emotion states go from being adaptive to what you'd call maladaptive and are accompanied by a mental illness. So that's really what neuroscience brings to the table. It's a mechanistic understanding of how the brain is generating these particular states and controlling the animal's behavior.
In the book, you mentioned some of your early interests and some of the genesis of how your lab started work in emotion. And now, of course, you have a lab that's pretty unique in studying jellyfish and flies and mice. And in addition to being the director of the Chen Neuroscience Institute, the Seymour Benzer Professor, you're a Howard Hughes medical investigator, a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Can you give us a brief sort of biographical sketch of how did this all start? How did your interest in science begin? How did it go into emotion? And where is your lab and your own interests currently? And what do you see for the future in less than 5,000 words?
Yeah, I'll try to make that as short as I can. I was a lab rat as a kid. I spent my summers in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is a scientific research community that has a marine biological laboratory, Woods Hole Oceanographic, because my father was a physicist. And I was always looking at the research labs in the biology building, like the kid with his face pressed up against the glass at the candy store, looking in and wishing they could get in and get their hands on all of this candy, because it really looked fun and it really looked exciting. And in particular, I was fascinated by animal behavior, even behavior, for example, of something like a sea scallop, which starts to jump away and flap its shells when a starfish approaches it and tries to eat it. You see these incredibly robust behavioral responses, and I really wanted to understand how they worked. And I got distracted for about 25 years by studying molecular biology and the development of the nervous system. And after a while, this is now back in 2020, after I'd been working on stem cells and neural development for almost 20 years.
Actually, when I first met you, I first met you, it must have been in the late 80s when I came here as a graduate student, and you were doing neural development. And
that's right.
Stem cells, yeah.
That's right. So there were a couple of things that made me want to switch. One is that I felt like I was getting a little bored and a little stale. Two, there was an avalanche of people moving into the stem cell field, and it was becoming extremely competitive. And I think I do my best work when I'm at early stages at the beginning of a field. And so I started thinking back about my old interests in behavior, and specifically animal behavior, and decided to try to pick on one particular type of behavior, like those associated with fear, and really try to map out the pathways in the brain, the circuitry that controls those behaviors. And I have to say that I was strongly influenced in this by my postdoctoral advisor, Richard Axel at Columbia, who is he's a molecular biologist and a Nobel laureate, but he often remarked to me that when people ask about genes and how do genes influence the behavior, they need to realize that genes don't control behavior, neural circuits control behavior. And in order to even begin to think about the relationship between genes and behavior, we have to understand the neural circuitry that underlies a particular behavior. And so there was an opportunity to bring tools from genetics and molecular biology to neuroscience to study innate behaviors like fear behaviors, aggressive behaviors, mating behaviors, and really try to work out the circuits. And that in turn made me interested in the internal states that accompany the execution of those behaviors, or to really ask about whether there were ways we could measure those states.
Great, thank you. So some of the examples you mentioned, and also what you spent time on in the book, are very few emotions. They're emotions related to threat, to fear, to aggression, mating behaviors one could add to this list. But if you survey the neuroscience of emotion in animals, it's a handful of rather modular looking specific ecological packages. On the other hand, if you talk to psychologists who study emotion in humans, they are fond of emphasizing the richness of human emotions and all the different varieties of emotions that we can experience. And of course, we have many, many words for emotions. In just a second. I just saw this book on my shelf here that I remembered I have. If you read books like this one, they have all these emotions in them. Many hiraeth, a Welsh word, hiraeth, describes a deeply felt connection to one's homeland. It's a rather yearning feeling flecked with suspense, as if something is about to be lost and never recovered. It goes on and on. It has, 100 or so words across many cultures that we have for describing emotions or the conscious experience of emotions. So that seems like a big difference. A few, very modular looking kinds of systems, but really a handful that are studied in animals, and then hundreds of words and shades of emotions, jealousy, awe, love, all of these things in humans. What's your response to that? Do you think that all of these exist, but we should start with a small package? Do you think that animals have many fewer emotions than humans? Or do you think that a lot of these, like in this book here by Tiffany Watt-Smith, the Book of Human Emotions, that many of those are not properly emotions? They're varieties of conscious experience, but not what you would call emotions. What's your view on this discrepancy between the rather apparently small number of emotions in animals and the huge number that psychologists think there are in humans?
Right. Well, because I'm a biologist, I have to have an evolutionary perspective on this as well as a neuroscience perspective. And as the geneticist Dobzhansky wrote, nothing in biology makes sense unless viewed in the light of evolution. And there are two types of evolution to think about when you think about emotion. One is the evolution of different kinds of emotion. So, for example, when did fear evolve? When did shame evolve? When did jealousy evolve? But there's and that's what most people think about when they think of the question of the evolution of emotions. But there's an even deeper question, which is, when did emotions evolve at all as a type of behavioral control mechanism on this planet? Emotions didn't just show up with humans or even with great apes. The precursors, the building blocks of emotion, I argue, can be found in organisms that are as distant from us as fruit flies. And what we want to understand is to try to piece together a picture of how biological organisms went from showing pure reflex behaviors, like you show when you lift your hand off a hot stove, or when the doctor hits your kneecap with a hammer in the office and your leg jerks out. How did animals go from having reflexes to having a control mechanism that is more flexible and more integrative and is not all or none, is not curtailed abruptly in time after a stimulus is terminated? What are those building blocks? How far back in evolution can we find them? And so what I would say is that that's the question we're interested in. But if you're interested in the question of when did different kinds of emotion evolve, then it matters very much what species you're studying. And I'm perfectly happy to think that there may be certain emotion states that are unique to humans, or at least to primates that are highly social animals. And then there will be other emotion states that are less common in animals that are not social, for example. And so if you want to study the evolution of different kinds of emotion, then you really have to be very circumspect about what particular species you're going to study them in. And that's the reason that we focus on fear and aggression and mating, is that these are some of the most evolutionarily ancient behaviors. They are critical for the survival and propagation of species. And so our feeling was that's the place to look if you want to try to find out how the brain makes these building blocks of emotion. What are they? How are they constructed by the circuitry and chemistry of the brain?
That makes a lot of sense. You need to understand the building blocks before you can understand the architecture of everything else.
Right.
Coming back to what you were saying about evolution and about possibly different kinds of emotions in humans or in other animals. So if we go to some very different, but also very complex animal, like an octopus. So our last common ancestor is probably around 600 million years ago. They have large nervous systems, 500 million neurons or so in a large octopus. What kinds of emotions could we see there? Or is there reason to think that animals like that are so different from us would just have completely alien emotions?
Right. So that's a very important point. And that is the second point that you raise, which is animals that don't look like us may have emotions that have nothing to do with emotions that we experience, and therefore we don't have words for them. And that points out the danger in trying to identify instances of emotional expression by analogy to humans, by anthropomorphizing them. It's much more objective to try to look for behaviors that display these building blocks of emotion. They can outlast the stimulus that triggered them. They can be weaker or stronger in their intensity, and they can transfer to different contexts and see if there are behaviors that the animal shows that exhibit those properties. One of my favorite examples of this concept of scalability, emotions waxing and waning. There's this amazing movie taken by Roger Hanlon at Woods Hole underwater of a diver, and the diver is swimming towards a rock that's covered with seaweed. And suddenly the front of the rock appears to melt away and turns white with a big eye in the middle and turns into an octopus that squirts out a jet of ink and propels itself off into the distance.
I remember
and when you
that.
watch, remember that film?
Yeah,
it's incredible. Yes. And what you realize is that what looked like just a lump of rock with seaweed on it was actually an octopus disguising itself by camouflage. And octopuses don't just change their color, they actually change the shape of their skin to make things that look like coral protrusions.
Yeah, they're
or
amazing.
Seaweed. It's incredible. But that in almost an instant, when the diver gets close enough, that switches to this alternative strategy. So what you're seeing is a switch as the intensity of a threat, namely the diver, gets closer and greater. The animal's defensive strategy switches from camouflage to jet propulsion, and running away. The first is designed to avoid detection. The second is designed to avoid entrapment. Now, we don't camouflage ourselves by changing our bodies. We can put camouflage paint on ourselves, but I would say that the more analogous behavior for people and mammals is freezing behavior. Freezing behavior also functions to avoid detection by a predator. If you don't move, maybe the predator won't be able to distinguish you from the background and will walk away. But if the predator does see you and starts coming towards you, then you better turn and run. And so that example of the increase in an internal state of whatever you want to call it, defensive arousal, threat alert, or a fear-like state, is an example of what I would say is a type of emotional behavior in octopi. Octopi can also show aggressive behavior. They can attack other octopi. They can attack other fish. There are great videos on YouTube showing this. Now, that doesn't mean they're angry. There's a difference between attaching a quality to the internal state that is something that we experience as a feeling in humans and just saying, well, this behavior is driven by some kind of state and isn't a reflex. And that's really what we want to, that's the question we want to ask. We don't want to worry about what are we calling this state. We want to understand how the state is made and constructed by the nervous system, what function it serves the organism, how it helps the organism survive and show the right behavior in the right circumstances.
So just picking up on that, on the emotion state, a little while ago, you said something like genes don't cause behavior. It's the intervening neural circuits that do. But of course, you could say, well, the neural circuits don't cause the behavior either. It's the muscles. So when you think of an internal emotion state, clearly there's genes and there's culture and there's the environment and a long history of evolution and development. And then there are neural circuits and electrical signals in the brain. There are chemicals and neurotransmitters. And then there's muscles and there's behavior. And so where along all of this complex causal path, and for that matter, even once you go into the brain, where from, say, visual input in the retina to seeing a predator to motor structures that control the muscles, where should we locate or how could we locate an emotion state?
Right, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that not only my lab but other labs at Caltech are thinking about. And my colleague Marcus Meister has coined this term, the inner brain, to distinguish the part of the brain where sensations and perceptions are converted into the precursors of action, to distinguish the inner brain from the outer brain, which are the muscles that control the motor behavior and the sensory cells that detect light, touch, sound, smell, and taste. And it is remarkably difficult to distinguish as one goes deeper into the brain. So let's say we look at the circuit that controls aggression, for example, which is triggered in mice and flies by smelling pheromones on another male. There's probably 6 to 8 synapses that connect different structures, sort of nodes and relay points between the cells that detect the smell and the neurons that control the muscles. What we don't see a sort of abrupt change in a place where suddenly there's no more representation of sensation, and it's all about a representation of action. We see a gradual transformation if we look at different stages along this pathway of relays where things become less sensory specific and more generic, and also show in the electrical activity properties like persistence. So if you look at a cell that responds to a rat in the visual system, that cell is only going to be active for as long as the rat is in front of the mouse. As soon as you take away the rat, those photoreceptors will stop firing. But if you look in the hypothalamus, for example, you will see cells that are excited by the rat, and they are specifically excited by rats and not by other types of threatening objects, but they remain excited for minutes after you take away the rat. And during the time those cells are excited, you can show that the animal remains in a state of agitation where it is more sensitive to other types of threats. And if you block that persistent neural activity during that time, the animal becomes fine and it loses this persistent anxiety or defensive state. So that's the type of signature and mechanism that we're looking for as we travel from the outer sensory part of the brain into the inner brain and try to understand how the brain asks certain basic questions about the outer world. You call these affordances in the language of philosophy, but I think of them as the brain wants to know, what is it that's out there? How do I feel about it, with quotes around feel, and what should I do about it? And the answers to those questions come as the inner brain is processing this information and figures out what it's perceiving, what state it should go into, and what behavior it should take.
Great, great. So one could literally look for some of these properties, features of an emotion state in the neurons in the brain, and use that to help partition what part of the neural circuit actually implements the emotion state.
Yes, that's right. And I would say that's one of the most important discoveries that we've made over the last 10 years. That is, it didn't have to be the case that neurons that we discovered that control, say, aggression or fear behaviors show in their firing patterns these building blocks of emotion, like long-lasting activity. It could have been that we were just finding a bunch of widgets that acted as a bunch of on-off switches to control aggressive behavior, like pulling strings on a marionette. But remarkably, we didn't find that. We found neurons that show these graded and long-lasting patterns of firing in response to stimuli, say threats or another male, that are only there transiently in front of the animal.
So we've spoken about, and in your book, you tell us a lot about your research on flies and on mice. And as we've just been talking, of course, it's important and very useful to study emotions, because we can study the building blocks, emotion primitives in these animals, and that will help us to understand how emotion came about, how it evolved, and how it gives rise to all the variety that we see in humans. But another reason to study animals like mice or flies is, of course, methodological. And you spend some time, and we learn quite a bit in the book about the methods that these particular species offer that are just simply not available in humans. I wonder if you can just give us a quick overview of what some of these methods are and why they are so powerful.
Yeah. That's a very important question. So when people study emotions in people, and they typically, like you, use brain scanning techniques, or maybe they have some electrodes on the scalp, and you can ask the person, how do you feel? And you can image patterns of activity in the brain, and you may find a correlation between the activity patterns and the person's report of whether they're afraid or not, but you don't know what the causal arrows are in that correlation. You don't know whether the brain activity is causing the feeling, which you might intuit. It could be that the feeling or the emotion is causing the brain activity, or there could be some third thing that you're not even measuring that is causing both. And the best example of that I like to cite, of why correlation doesn't imply causation, is that both ice cream consumption and violence increase in the summer. Is that because after people are violent, they want to go eat an ice cream cone? Or is it because eating an ice cream cone makes people want to beat somebody up? No, it's because both of those behaviors increase when it gets hotter. And so what you can do in animals that you can't do in humans is you can delve into the inner workings of the brain. You can actually go into the brain and turn individual neurons or groups of neurons on and off to see whether that causes a change in the animal's behavior. And if you don't see such an effect of that manipulation, even if the activity of that cell is correlated with the behavior, there is no obvious function that you can assign to that group of neurons. So this issue, this importance of causality is critical, and it's critical in medicine. Especially everything that we know about in other branches of medicine besides psychiatry for treatments is based on a causal understanding of physiology and disease. Once we learned what insulin was, we discovered that people who are diabetic have a deficiency of insulin. We understood that diabetes phenotype disease was caused by not enough insulin, and that made us realize we could treat diabetes by giving diabetics more insulin, and it actually worked. We don't have medications in psychiatry that work that way because we don't yet have a cause and effect understanding of the relationship between brain activity, normal emotion, and mental illness. And it's only through studies in animals that we're going to be able to extract that causal information.
So I think we have just a few minutes left. And again, to our audience, if you have questions, post them into the Q&A feature in the Zoom. Let me ask you then a sort of closing broad question, perhaps. One reason that I found the book so engaging and fun to read is that it actually spends a fair amount of time describing actually doing science. You describe what some of the people in your lab are actually doing and how a particular study came about, how you tried to persuade somebody to do a certain experiment. So given your long career and given your mentoring of postdoctoral fellows and students in the lab, what advice or pointers would you have for those in our audience who might be thinking about going into emotion science and actually doing research? If I were a graduate student or a postdoc and I want to research emotion, are there particular approaches, particular species that you would recommend for somebody like that? Are there particular domains that you would recommend avoiding to go into? What advice would you give to the young emotion researcher?
I would offer two things first. One is that you have to keep an open mind and not make assumptions about how you think nature is likely to work, but let nature give you the hints and the clues to tell you in which direction you should move with your experiments. That I call that sort of following my nose, and I'm very much a follow your nose kind of scientist. The other thing I would say is if you want to go into emotion, you have to be able to live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether your best explanation for your data is actually right. Because emotion is complex, the brain is complex. There are hundreds of uncontrolled variables in any experiment. And in the end, our explanation for the results of the experiment are at best an approximation. And there are scientists that just don't want to deal with that. And so they go into structural biology. I mean, once you have the crystal structure of a potassium channel, it's done. It's permanent. It will last through all of history, and it isn't going to change. Whereas in the case of emotion research, we're chipping away at pieces of a very, very large puzzle, and we have to be able to live with incomplete information and incomplete answers. So I would say that's important. And then I would say you have to be willing to do science in a cooperative manner. You have to be a social person to do emotion research because it's so interdisciplinary. It draws on so many different areas of science, from physics and molecular biology and psychology and genetics. It's not a good field to go into if you just want to work all by yourself, hermit-like, holed up in your laboratory. So being a sort of scientifically gregarious and open-minded person is good as well. And you also have to develop a critical sense. You have to be able to look at your own data critically and know when to say, my favorite beautiful explanation for these data that I was loving for the last 2 or 3 years is probably wrong, and let go of it and give it up in your effort to get closer to the truth.
With that humbling advice, thank you, David. This was great. It was a lot of fun, and I can see we have a number of questions already in the Q&A. I think Raul is going to be reading them out.
Absolutely, gentlemen. And they're really wonderful questions. So let me just start off with Kunal Muli. This is his question. If organisms as distant as Drophila, sorry if I don't pronounce these correctly, can have emotional states, it begs the question, could emotional states exist in organisms having no neurons? And if so, then what really could the building blocks of emotional states be, and how could they come about in nature at a fundamental level?
Right. So that's an excellent question. And if you think about an organism that displays responses to stimuli that has no neurons, you might think about a bacterial cell or an amoeba. And bacteria have complex responses to stimuli, like multicellular organisms, such as worms, which have 302 neurons. Bacteria detect smells they like, swim towards them. They detect smells they don't like, and they avoid them. And I would say that those are examples of reflexive behavior, but nevertheless, the underlying biochemistry and molecular biology of some of those responses may have features that are analogous to the emotion primitives that we are talking about here. There may be persistent biochemical pathways that are activated. The level of a certain chemical inside the bacterial cell could affect its behavior. So I would say those are analogous, but I would argue strongly that emotion states are a property of nervous systems, or at least as a neuroscientist, they're the property of nervous systems I want to understand. We've posed a slightly different problem, which is, do you need a brain to have emotion primitives? And that's why we've started studying jellyfish, because jellyfish have behaviors. They defend themselves from threats, they mate, they eat, they swim in different ways. They have no brain. They just have distributed neurons. And so we would like to see if those organisms are really just controlled by a bunch of hardwired reflexes, if they're just little squishy robots, or whether they have some of these emotion primitives as well.
Yeah, just to chime in on that, I don't know if David would fully agree with this, but I think he would agree that in principle, you could have emotions in a robot made of silicon, provided it has the right internal structure. In the simplest case, just replace every neuron with a transistor, but otherwise everything's the same. It would have emotion states. There's no reason not to. There might be disagreement about whether or not it has conscious experiences. Kunal, the person who's asking the question, is actually interested in consciousness here at Caltech. I don't know, David doesn't know, nobody knows about the consciousness part. But I think we could attribute emotion states to a robot if it has the right internal architecture.
Yeah, we could build them in. We could build an architecture into a robot that would give it those properties that might help it do a better job of navigating around Mars and making decisions about whether to keep going or to stop when the going got rough, for example. And there might be more timid robots.
Exactly. I would build a robot with no fear.
Right.
Would outperform the humans.
That's right.
Okay, Raul.
Yes. So Yeah, our next question comes from Carolyn Patterson. What is the connection of hormones with emotions? For example, the release of adrenaline when you are afraid or angry, which propel you to take action. For example, being startled by a snake on a hike always gives me an adrenaline rush.
Very good question. So chemicals in the brain are very important for behavior, but chemicals do not cause behavior. Neural circuits and muscle cause behavior. And so this whole concept that flight or fight is controlled by the release of adrenaline from a gland that lies on top of your kidneys is really misleading, because it's your brain that decides whether to fight or flight. And what the adrenaline does is it prepares your body, it opens your blood vessels to maximize oxygen and blood flow to your muscles to jump out of the way when you hear that snake and you're hiking on the trail. It provides more glucose to the brain so that you can think faster and make critical decisions. Other types of hormones, for example, stress hormones, which are steroid hormones, or sex hormones, which are also steroid hormones, clearly have an important effect on mood, but they themselves don't embody the mood or the emotion. They act on neural circuits that in turn somehow control that particular state. In the same way, there's nothing about dopamine, the chemical, that intrinsically makes someone happy. Dopamine in other systems, in flies, dopamine can make certain flies afraid in certain parts of the brain. It all has to do with what circuitry the chemicals are acting on and whether the chemicals are increasing the activity of the circuit or decreasing the activity of the circuit. And that's one of the most poorly understood parts of neuroscience. It's the interaction between what you would call the electronic brain, which sort of sounds like a computer, and the chemical brain, which sounds like a bag of fluid with serotonin and dopamine floating around in it. And both analogies are wrong for thinking about the brain because there's an interaction between the two, and we need to understand that better.
Raul, next one.
Yes, our next question is from, and forgive me if I don't pronounce this correctly, Ji-Yu Zheng. And the question is, do you think there are types of emotions that only exist in animals but not in humans? How should we look for them?
Very good. I believe that's probably true. I don't know that it is true, but the way that we should look for them is by applying some of these criteria that distinguish reflexes from internal states. Again, we're not asking whether the animal has subjective feelings. That requires consciousness, but we're asking whether a certain behavior that it shows, even if we don't recognize it in ourselves, might have these properties of being able to scale up and down, to last longer than the stimulus, to generalize to different circumstances, to make the animal approach something or avoid something, to communicate to other members of its species. And if we can see those properties in the waving of a Martian's tentacle, then we may be able to ascribe the waving of that tentacle to as an expression of an internal emotion state. We then need to find out what is the function of the waving of the tentacle. What does that do for the Martian? What does that do for the octopus, for example? But I think that's what I keep emphasizing. It's not what you call these states, it's what their properties are and how those properties are encoded by the nervous system that we want to understand. I think it would be great if people can identify behaviors that show these emotion primitives in some animals and they have no counterpart in humans, because then we know we're free of the trap of anthropomorphizing in thinking about how these behaviors are controlled.
Presumably, David, the emotion primitives, the properties of emotions like persistence, scalability, those would be universally shared since we share a common world. I mean, they
Yes.
would be common principles, and so you would think there would be homology at that level. If aliens come from some place where the laws of physics are completely different, or everything is completely alien, well, then all bets are off, and
Right.
we wouldn't know what to say.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. This presupposes that there are stimuli in the environment that come and go, they're time limited, that there's gravity, that there is a ground that or an airspace that animals interact with, and all of these processes have evolved to adapt animals to that context, whether they live on land, live in the air, or live in the ocean.
Raul?
You ready? Here you go. This is from Ananda Ganguly. You talked about the persistence of emotional state in the brain. How is that different from memory?
Very good. It is a form of memory. It's a short-term memory, but it is not something that you can recall later on necessarily. It is a response to a stimulus that out in the neurons that respond to that stimulus that outlasts the presence of that inciting stimulus. And so I would say an example of that is arousal. In flies, we and others have found neurons that when activated can cause a persistent state of social arousal that makes the flies more likely to engage in mating or fighting. And it lasts for 10 minutes after those neurons have no longer been stimulated. And so that is but it's not that there's some way that the fly has of recalling that particular state. So memory in its loosest sense can be used to describe any property that has an influence on things that happen later than the immediate moment when that original response occurred. People use memory to describe T cells and B cells in the immune system and describing how we react to COVID infections. But there's very different kinds of memory. So if you want to think of emotional persistence as a form of memory, as long as you keep clear in your mind that it doesn't mean that it's something specific that you can recall when you get another stimulus, that's fine. Now, there are forms of learning that tie together emotional responses to stimuli, like fear conditioning. You can learn to be afraid of something innocuous if every time you see that innocuous thing, something bad happens to you. After a while, even if nothing bad happens, if you see that innocuous object, you're going to freeze, you're going to cringe, or you're going to run away. So in that respect, there is a stored memory of the association between an innocuous stimulus and an emotion that can be recalled. But that's not the same thing as the persistence of, say, an anxiety state or a fear state in response to a predator that just walked in front of you.
This reminds me of an experiment that my colleague Daniel Tranel at the University of Iowa did some years ago. I can't remember where it was published, maybe PNAS. But so in that study in humans, what they did was they took patients who were densely amnesic, so they cannot remember what happened more than about a minute or so, and they showed them very sad movies. And so right after watching the movie, the patients rated how they felt, and they rated that they were very sad. They were then distracted for a couple of minutes, and then they rated again how they felt, and they rated they felt very sad. When asked why they felt sad, they had no idea. They couldn't remember that it was the movie that had made them sad, but the state of sadness had persisted. So that's a very clear case in humans where you have a dissociation between the persistence of a particular emotion with a long time constant, as it were, sadness, and actual memory, as we commonly think of it.
Yeah, that's very important. Very, very, very good example.
Raul, do we have more time for any further
I think
questions?
we have a few more. We have a few more questions, and according to our stage manager, we've got a little bit more time. So let me read the next question from Sean Patino, and it says, or he asks, is there a baseline emotion state that only changes after a stimuli is presented to the animal? If yes, does the state vary between species?
Is there a base? Could you read the question one more time? I'm not sure that I understood it.
Is there a baseline emotion state that only changes after a stimulus is presented to the animal? If yes, does that state vary between species?
I see. Is there a baseline stimulus? I guess you're asking if the animal is seemingly doing nothing, say it's just a mouse walking around in its cage, pausing now and then to nibble on its food, is it in any emotion state that could be cranked up or cranked down according to the presence of various stimuli, or do animals have a ground state where sort of everything is shut off? I think it's very hard to prove the latter, that there's a ground state where everything is shut off. I can say that the part of the hypothalamus that we study that controls defensive behaviors, aggression, fear, when you measure activity in that region, it is very quiet if the animal is just walking around in its cage, minding its own business. The minute that you introduce another mouse, for example, into that cage, activity explodes in this region of the brain. Many, many neurons start skyrocketing on and off. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other resting brain states. People sometimes who work in the cortex talk about up states and down states. Up states being one where there's a lot of reactivity in the network, down states being one where the activity is not as strong and the system is not as excitable. Those states might turn out to be very important in thinking about disorders like bipolar disorders, where the state that the person is in on a long-term basis can affect the way they respond to a particular stimulus. So I would say the assumption should be that even if you can't tell by looking, there's always some kind of state going on in the animal. You just have to know the right part of the brain to look in, and you have to measure the right types of behavior.
Great. Our next question. I'm sorry, Ralph, were you adding something?
Well, I could, I guess, briefly. I guess it's an interesting distinction between what psychologists might commonly call a trait versus a state. So you could be in a mood, what we would normally call a mood, for instance, always or for some very long period of time, but that would be different than an emotion state, which we think of as more phasic and more tightly linked to an actual challenging stimulus. But to some extent, the answer becomes semantic. It all depends on what you want to call an emotion. The Nobel laureate Herbert Simon wrote a paper back in the 60s or so. His view was that emotions should be thought of functionally as some kind of interrupt mechanism for just average baseline behavior. And I think many psychologists would think of it that way too, that we want to think of some kind of environmental challenge, a predator, a threat, a mate. And at least in the clearest example, those elicited states are what we might call emotions. Now, baseline moods, of course, there are always states all the time in the brain. And whether or not you want to classify those as, mild emotions of certain kinds, again, I think it becomes semantic.
Right. Even when the animal is sleeping, its brain is in a state. People are defining the characteristics of the sleep state in the brain.
Right.
All right. Our next question is from Archer Ahmed. In your opinion, are there any factors external to the neurons and DNA that might control species emotional behavior?
Extrinsic to the neurons and the DNA. I don't know if he means extrinsic but inside the body or extrinsic and outside the body. I'm going to assume that he means extrinsic but inside the body. That is, things that are not in the neuron or the machinery of neurons. And of course, there are all kinds of influences. There are influences of hormones. There are influences of blood flow because brain tissue is highly vascularized, levels of energy, and those could certainly have major effects on how a particular part of the nervous system responds, and they could be different in different species. We haven't talked at all, for example, about the role of glia. These are the non-neuronal cells in the brain that people used to think of as sort of glue that held the neurons together, but which are turning out to be increasingly important in actually signaling. And so and talking occurs, crosstalk occurs between neurons and glia. So certainly that's one example of an influence that occurs outside of the neuron and is not its DNA. Of course, the glial cell has the same DNA as the neuron, but it's a cell extrinsic influence.
Yeah, I think, there are, as you probably know, classical theories of emotion that posit a particular role for the body. For instance, William James had this, my postdoctoral mentor, Antonio Damasio, where there's some kind of influence of the neural circuitry of the brain on the body, and that in turn feeds back to the brain and alters brain function. And so I think, having some influence in that way of the body certainly seems one part of an extended emotion sequence.
Right.
All
This,
right.
of course, still doesn't get at the fundamental issue, as my friend Christoph Koch likes to say, given that the brain is made of neurons and neurons are just protoplasm with lipid around them and ions flowing across the lipid, why should that feel like anything? Why should the activation of ions flowing across the lipids of a neuron that's in your spine and that connects to your skin when you touch a hot stove, why should that feel painful? Maybe it has to do with what people call these reentrant loops. It's the brain acting on the body and the body somehow acting back on the brain. And it's a combination of these outward and inward responses. But it's still, I think, an unanswerable question, which is why those of us working in animals try to leave feeling out of it, because that fundamentally we can't explain how a feeling arises from the movement of ions across lipid membranes through ion channels.
The philosopher Leibniz had this nice vision, this analogy that he said, imagine if you miniaturized yourself and you would, go inside the brain and look around, right? What would you find? Well, you would find exactly what David just said. You find molecules and, electrical potentials, chemicals, but you don't find feelings. You would never guess that there's a feeling, that there's anything going on other than just these physical processes. So that topic, feelings and conscious experiences in general, indeed, will remain enigmatic. Perhaps your next book, David.
Yeah, we'll have to write that one together like we did the first one.
All right, gentlemen, we're coming down to our final two questions, and I know there's so many more, but what I'll do is I'll send those questions to you after this event and see if we can't. We have emails for all these individuals. So the second to the last question is from Bruce Cohen, and his question is: in humans, the prefrontal cortex appears to play an important role in regulating, inhibiting impulse emotional behavior, presumably via the activation of the D2 receptors on target neurons. What mechanism underlies the ability of this brain region to selectively inhibit emotionally driven behavior?
Well, I think Ralph will have much more to say about humans than I can, but I'll just say that the idea of a sort of top-down inhibitory influence on impulse, which comes from people with certain kinds of brain damage, is a very strong one. But the number of cases where you can find that in mice, for example, is relatively small. And there are as many cases where the influence of the prefrontal cortex on, say, fear behavior is to augment fear behavior as it is to depress fear behavior. There are different types of neurons in the medial prefrontal cortex mixed together, and they can have opposite direction effects on the subcortical brain. So I think it's an oversimplification. And I also think that the idea that this is mediated by dopamine receptors, I mean, they may be part of the story, but they're certainly not the whole story. For one thing, most of the neurons that project out of the prefrontal cortex are excitatory neurons. So if you're positing that they are inhibiting impulsive behavior, there's got to be an inhibitory interneuron somewhere along the way that switches the sign of that influence so that it shuts off the impulse instead of activates it. But Ralph, you have more knowledge of this.
Well, not much more. As you say, it's complicated. It certainly is the case that humans compared to other species, and adult humans for that matter compared to infants, can have some control over their emotion behavior, and to some extent emotion states and emotion experiences, emotion regulation as it's called. But as you also say, it can go up or down. It has an influence, but it's not necessary. It would be too simple to say it's inhibitory. There are mechanistic studies looking at one particular inhibitory role, which is fear extinction, which is once you have acquired, in a fear conditioning study, once you have acquired a fear of something, there is a mechanistic role for the prefrontal cortex in inhibiting a structure called the amygdala in fear extinction. But again, that particular part, what I just said, is one small component of the actual behavior of everything that goes on in fear extinction, which is much more complicated. So the quick answer to your question is yes, one of the many roles of prefrontal cortex is indeed to help to participate in regulating emotions. And there is a correlation between the expansion of prefrontal cortex in the evolution of mammals and primates, and especially humans, and their ability to regulate emotion. But beyond that, it gets very complicated very, very quickly. But it is a target for sure for psychopathology, for phobias, anxiety disorders, that some kind of dysregulation in the way that the prefrontal cortex can regulate emotions plays a role.
Now, there's so many good questions, but this, I think, is a perfect question to end this segment and then ask Michael Alexander, our program director, to join us. And here's the question. It's from Kunal, who asked earlier, what are the most exciting questions that will be answered in this field in the coming years, and what should we really look forward to?
That's always hard to predict because science takes all kinds of twists and turns, but I think we are getting close to a better ability to predict states and behavior of animals by looking at patterns of brain activity on a large scale and kind of trying to reconstruct the landscape, almost like a topographic landscape of brain activity, and map when it's in certain valleys and when it's on certain hills, and to understand how the shape of that landscape is altered in different mood states, in different physiological states, and how chemical signals in the brain interact with the electronics of the brain to shape that landscape. And I find that a very exciting level to think about the brain, because it abstracts up from just the level of individual neurons, and this neuron does this and that neuron does that. It says it's the chorus of neurons that you have to pay attention to, or the whole orchestra that is going to predict what you want to know about what the animal is going to do next, not just individual cells. Ralph, what's your
my answer would be analogous, which is, I think, what we would look forward to is putting it all together, and in particular putting together research in animal models with work in humans. And one of the incentives, I think, for David's book and for the book that David and I wrote a few years ago, The Neuroscience of Emotion, was to try to bring together what's really a very fractured field. Psychologists working on emotion in humans, the kind of work that David does. You publish in different journals, you go to different meetings. And so bringing emotion together and forming an integrative science where all of these different parts can contribute, I think that should be an aim, and hopefully will be realized in the future. And hopefully this dialogue will have contributed a small part to that.
I hope so. These are all great questions. Thank you all very much.
Yes, thanks.
And now it's my turn to say thank you to David and Ralph for a most interesting conversation and for your generous responses to the questions from our viewers. And David, your answer to Ralph's last question that touched on the collaborative nature of science made me grateful that there's so many opportunities for collaboration at Caltech. For those of you in Pasadena, Vromans is now carrying the book, The Nature of the Beast, How Emotions Guide Us. So you can check out our, I think it's our One City bookstore. I don't think they're based anywhere else, but check out Vromans to get your copy of The Nature of the Beast. And I want to thank the staff that makes these presentations run as smoothly as they do. Leslie Maxfield of the Academic Media Technology Office, Corinne Shore, our house manager for this evening, Raul Espinoza, our marketing consultant and our host for the Q&A tonight, and the others who I didn't get to name who worked behind the scenes to make this kind of a program possible. And I want to thank Caltech employees, Federal Credit Union, and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium for their support. And remember, we have a great outdoor event coming up on June 24th. It'll take place on the Beckman Mall, and it's featuring Naturally 7. You can spot them on YouTube and elsewhere to just get a taste of what they're going to present. And it'll be a great dance party if you want to get up and dance. It'll be an evening when you can actually bring your whole family and enjoy the program. And this program will, and you can stay in touch with us and see this program online. You can tell your friends that they can go and see it online in a few days. And you can just do that by joining events.caltech.edu. And you can get more information there also about the Friends of Beckman Auditorium. So again, a special thanks to David J. Anderson and Ralph Adolphs for sharing their time with us this evening. Thank you for joining us. And during this pandemic times, please stay safe. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone. Raul, for organizing this.